In this lecture presentation, we'll be reviewing the anatomy of the central nervous system. As always, I recommend that you have your slides and interactive study guide available so that you can take notes and answer the questions as we progress through this lecture. We'll start with a brief overview of the entire nervous system before we dive into the central nervous system. To start, the central nervous system, which is oftentimes abbreviated as CNS, is comprised of the brain and spinal cord. The rest of the nervous system is all the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system helps connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. The somatic nervous system connects the central nervous system with the sensory motor organs. The somatic nervous system is sometimes referred to as the voluntary nervous system, and that's because it's the part of the peripheral nervous system that's associated with voluntary control of bodily movements via skeletal muscles. The somatic nervous system consists of afferent nerves, or sensory nerves, and efferent nerves, otherwise known as motor nerves. The autonomic nervous system is sometimes referred to as the involuntary nervous system, and that's because it regulates muscles and glands that we typically don't think of as under our voluntary control. For example, how many of you right now are telling your hearts to beat or your lungs to fill with air? Now, while we are not fully in control of these muscles and glands, we do have some effect on them. For example, we can train ourselves to have some control over our heart rate and our breathing rates. The autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. While the sympathetic nervous system is often referred to as the fight, flight, freeze response, the sympathetic nervous system is often referred to as the rest and digest response. We'll go into more detail about the autonomic nervous system when we cover the stress response in Unit 2 of this course. This image displays the divisions of the central nervous system. The spinal cord, pictured in yellow, is at the very bottom of the central nervous system, and it brings information into and away from the brain. Moving up from there, you'll see the brain is subdivided into the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. The hindbrain can be further subdivided into the myelencephalon, also referred to as the medulla, and the metencephalon, which is subdivided into the cerebellum and the pons. The mesencephalon is also referred to as the midbrain. In the forebrain, it is subdivided into the diencephalon and the telencephalon. The diencephalon refers to some subcortical structures like the thalamus and hypothalamus, whereas the telencephalon, which also includes some subcortical structures, including those in the limbic system and basal ganglia, but also includes the neocortex, which is also referred to as the cerebral cortex. We are going to explore all of these regions throughout the rest of this lecture presentation. Let's start with the spinal cord. First, it's important to note that the spinal cord is located within the spinal column, which we oftentimes refer to as the spine. While the spinal cord does belong in the central nervous system, the spinal column is actually part of the skeletal system. As I mentioned earlier, the spinal cord brings information into the brain and carries information away from the brain. It communicates with all sensory organs and muscles, excluding those in the head. The dorsal roots of the spinal cord carry sensory information into the brain. The dorsal root ganglia, that cell body cluster located in the periphery, is located again outside of the spinal cord. The ventral roots carry motor information away from the brain. These cell bodies are located inside the spinal cord and project to other areas throughout the body. Now, quick review. The dorsal roots carry sensory information, while the ventral roots carry motor information. Is the motor nerve closer to your chest or to your shoulder blades? The answer is your chest, because the motor nerves are located on the ventral side of the spinal cord, which we know is towards the stomach. Gray matter and white matter were discussed in the last lecture presentation. In terms of the spinal cord, the gray matter, where the cell bodies are located, is in the center of the spinal cord. The white matter that carries information from the cell bodies in the gray matter is located around the outside of the spinal cord. It delivers information to the brain or to different areas of the spinal cord. Before we move into the human brain, we need to cover the cranial nerves. There are 12 cranial nerves, and they each serve very specific and important functions in the nervous system. Starting with cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve's major function is to help facilitate the experience of smell. Similarly, the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, helps support vision. Unlike smell, vision requires the additional efforts of multiple other cranial nerves, which we'll discuss next. Cranial nerve 3 is the ocular motor nerve. It helps with control of eye movements, including pupil constriction. The trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, helps control with eye movements as well. I'll get back to the trigeminal nerve in just a bit, but I want to point out that cranial nerve 6, the abducens nerve, also helps with the control of eye movements. The oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens cranial nerves together are referred to as the extraocular muscle system. They work in unison for sight and for other eye functions as well. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve. It functions to help facilitate skin sensations for most of the face, as well as control of jaw muscles that are needed for functions such as chewing and swallowing. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. It helps with taste in the anterior or forward 2/3 of the tongue, control of facial expressions like crying and salivation, as well as dilation of blood vessels in the head. Cranial nerve 8 is the statoacoustic nerve. It facilitates hearing and the sense of equilibrium. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, helps with taste and other sensations in the throat and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. It also facilitates swallowing, salivation, and throat movements needed to create speech. Cranial nerve 10, as nerdy as this might sound, is my personal favorite cranial nerve. It facilitates sensations from the neck and thorax, control of the throat, esophagus, and larynx, and most importantly to me, it is a major component of the parasympathetic nervous system. Its nerves connect to the stomach, GI tract, and organ, and is part of why, when we are in parasympathetic activation, we tend to experience enhanced digestion. The accessory cranial nerve is nerve number 11. It helps with control of neck and shoulder movements. Lastly, the hypoglossal cranial nerve number 12 helps with the control of tongue muscles. We're going to go over the major components of the human brain separately, but I wanted to provide this image so that you can refer back to get an understanding of where all of these pieces fit together to create the overall human brain. Those of you who like to pause the recording to watch the videos might consider pausing here to watch the video Major Regions of the Brain, You might also check out the resource, the 3D Brain, which will also help with visualization in terms of where these regions are located and what they look like up close. The cerebellum is the largest structure of the hindbrain, and it's oftentimes referred to as its nickname, the little brain. If you look at the cerebellum in the bottom picture, you'll see it's colored in brown towards the bottom right. You can see how it looks similar to the rest of the brain, as though it's its own little brain. Interestingly, the cerebellum occupies 10 to 14% of the entire human brain. It serves some very important functions, including coordinating motor movements with the brain and spinal cord. It helps with motor development, motor learning, and motor memory. Damage to the cerebellum can cause a condition known as ataxia, which is a fancy term for loss of coordination. It's essentially loss of coordination of voluntary movements, but in absence of any weakness or sensory loss. So the person is capable of coordination, but seemingly is challenged in terms of that coordination at a given time. Can you think of a common example of a person who might be experiencing ataxia? The answer is people who are drunk. They technically have the ability to have coordinated voluntary movement. They don't have weakness or sensory loss. However, roadside tests are essentially tests of ataxia. Does the person have the coordination necessary to complete the tasks? The cerebellum also coordinates with the vestibular, auditory, and visual systems. In doing so, it helps facilitate smooth movement, balance, and posture. It also helps with shifting attention between auditory stimuli and visual stimuli, what we hear and what we see. Similarly, it helps with a sense of timing. In its coordination with the limbic system and cerebral cortex, it facilitates higher order functions that have only more recently been determined. While this is still under investigation, the cerebellum does seem to have involvement in certain cognitive and affective abilities. Damage to the cerebellum can result in what is known as cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, which sheds light on the important functions of the cerebellum in terms of cognitive and affective abilities. The brainstem refers to certain parts of the hindbrain in addition to the midbrain. It's essentially the hindbrain plus the midbrain minus the cerebellum. Those of you who like to pause the lecture recording to watch the videos might pause here to watch the video Hand Model of the Brain. While the hand model of the brain does cover multiple brain regions, one aspect of the video that is commented on in regards to the brainstem is that in the hand model of the brain, the wrist serves as the brainstem. The brainstem is explained as the reptilian brain in the video, which is a really important concept. The brainstem connects to the majority of the cranial nerves. We'll start with the medulla. First off, one question I get quite often is there a difference between medulla and medulla oblongata, a brain region made famous by the water boy? No, there is no difference between the medulla and the medulla oblongata, except that it's much easier and shorter and simpler to say medulla. The medulla is the continuation of the spinal cord into the brain. It mostly facilitates automated functions, like breathing, heart rate, coughing, and vomiting. The pons is essentially a bridge where the axons cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord. It is the reason why most brain functions are contralateral in nature. That is, what happens on one side of the brain generally governs what happens on the opposite side of the body. Pons actually means bridge in Latin. There are two very important nuclei located in the pons. First, the locus ceruleus is a nuclei of norepinephrine cell bodies. We might also refer to them as adrenergic cell bodies. The raphe nuclei, which is located in the pons and the medulla, is a cluster of serotonergic cell bodies. The reticular formation extends throughout the entire brainstem, so it's not localized in any certain region of the brainstem. The reticular formation are nuclei that govern awareness, alertness, the sleep-wake cycle, and muscle tone. The midbrain, which is also a component of the brainstem, will be discussed on the next slide. The midbrain is comprised of two major regions, the tectum and the tegmentum. Tectum actually means roof, and it is the top part of the midbrain. The tectum serves as the interface between sensory stimuli and our behavioral motor patterns. There are two important regions that are part of the tectum, and those are the superior and inferior colliculi. They help govern sensory processing. Specifically, the superior colliculus helps govern visual processing, while the inferior colliculus helps process auditory processing. Based on what you learned in the anatomical terminology lecture presentation, you might have been able to reason that the superior colliculus lies above the inferior colliculus. The tegmentum is also an important structure of the midbrain. There are three important areas of the tegmentum that we'll cover. First, the periaqueductal gray region, oftentimes abbreviated as PAG. The periaqueductal gray region is known for its role in pain suppression. There's a very high level of endorphin receptors located in the periaqueductal gray. The substantia nigra is a nuclei of dopaminergic cell bodies and is the origin of the nigrostriatal tract. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture presentation, there are 4 dopamine tracts, one of which is the nigrostriatal tract that projects from the nuclei in the substantia nigra to the striatum of the basal ganglia. Another nuclei of dopaminergic cell bodies is located in the ventral tegmental area. These cell bodies actually project to 2 different regions and therefore serve as 2 separate tracts. They are often combined as though they are a singular tract for the purpose of discussion because they all project from the same region, which is the ventral tegmental area. From the VTA, dopamine cell bodies project to the cortex and to the limbic system. When they're considered together, they're referred to as the mesocorticolimbic tract. However, when discussed separately, they're referred to as the mesocortical tract and the mesolimbic tract. Whereas the nigrostriatal tract governs movement, particularly the initiation and modulation of movement, the mesocorticolimbic tract governs functions such as the experience of reward, motivation, learning, and memory. We'll talk about limbic areas next and the cortex towards the end of this lecture. The limbic system is a combination of brain regions that help integrate and regulate emotional responses and motivated behavior. These brain structures are located at the border between the brainstem and the rest of the forebrain. You can consider it as the beginning of the forebrain. Classification of the limbic system varies. It always includes the amygdala and the hippocampus, but it also includes other brain regions we haven't discussed yet, such as the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the anterior cingulate cortex, the septum, and a variety of other regions as well. For now, we'll focus on the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala is essentially the watchdog of the brain. It sends distress signals to the hypothalamus when it perceives any threat to safety, whether that's physical safety or emotional safety. Those of you who have watched the Disney Pixar film Inside Out might recognize the amygdala as essentially the purple character. He's looking out for Riley's needs and alerting her to threats, such as the cord she nearly trips on. The amygdala is alert to basic survival needs. Things like sex, feeding, and again, safety. It also helps facilitate emotional responses and emotional memories. So you can thank your limbic system, particularly your amygdala, if when you smell peach pie, you have warm feelings of spending the summers with your grandma. The hippocampus' major function is the establishment of long-term memories and the sense of being present. And by being present, I mean the ability to monitor where you are and where you're going. The hippocampus is essential to the ability to create new memories. Damage to the hippocampus can be catastrophic and nearly always causes some form of amnesia. If you're curious to know what might happen if you had damage or no hippocampus at all, you could pause the recording now to watch the video, What Happens When You Remove the Hippocampus? Moving on to the thalamus and hypothalamus. The thalamus is essentially located at the very center of the forebrain. Those of you who understand the basic functions of a router can use that as a helpful analogy for understanding the functions of the thalamus. It helps to process, sort, and direct all sensory motor information, with the exception of olfaction, which refers to the sense of smell. The thalamus helps regulate our level of awareness by helping the cortex to direct attention to what it deems to be the most important message coming in at the time. The thalamus also has important roles in regulating pain and sleep. The hypothalamus is a very important brain region that is almost the conductor of the neuroendocrine system. It helps regulate homeostasis in the body by making changes as needed to things like temperature, salt-water balance, hunger, thirst, responses to stress, and a myriad of other factors as well. It controls the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system. And a lot of people refer to this as the 5 Fs, which include fever, feeding, fighting, falling asleep, and fornication. The hypothalamus is attached to the pituitary gland via the pituitary stalk. If you're interested to see what this looks like, you could take a look at slide 6. Towards the bottom of that image, you'll see the hypothalamus connected to the pituitary gland. The pituitary looks like it's hanging from the brain. The hypothalamus has neural control of the posterior pituitary, and that's because the posterior pituitary gland is actually part of the brain and therefore part of the central nervous system. The hypothalamus also has hormonal control of the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is glandular material and belongs to the endocrine system. Therefore, you can see how the hypothalamus is both the conductor of the neurological posterior pituitary, as well as the conductor of the hormonal endocrine gland of the anterior pituitary. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the stress response in later lectures. Moving up towards the higher order, more advanced parts of the forebrain is the basal ganglia. Similar to the limbic system, classification of the basal ganglia also varies, and it also is comprised of multiple brain regions. The basal ganglia is comprised primarily of the striatum, which is comprised in and of itself of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. In addition to the striatum, the basal ganglia is comprised of the globus pallidus. We discussed the nigrostriatal tract earlier in this lecture presentation. Dopamine in the nigrostriatal tract projects from the substantia nigra to the basal ganglia, specifically to the striatum. The basal ganglia major function is motor control and executive functions. In terms of motor control and motor learning, we're talking about things like planning and executing motor behaviors. That includes the initiation, smoothness, and termination of movement. There are two fairly well-known disorders that relate to dysfunction of the basal ganglia. First, Parkinson's disease. A known symptom of Parkinson's disease is difficulty with initiating voluntary movement. This is due to insufficient dopamine from the substantia nigra to the striatum. What happens here is that insufficient dopamine is produced in the substantia nigra. Therefore, there's insufficient dopamine to be released in the striatum. This leads to difficulty initiating voluntary movement. Similarly, but oppositely at the same time, with Huntington's disease, there's difficulty suppressing involuntary movement. This is due to low levels of GABA. From this, you can see how essential it is that we have balanced levels of dopamine and GABA in the basal ganglia in order to support what we would refer to as normal movement. In terms of executive functions and behaviors, the basal ganglia helps with learned skills, habits, directing attention, motivation, and emotional behaviors. Those of you who have basic understanding of ADHD might have recognized a lot of similarities there, and that's because ADHD has also been implicated as a potential outcome of dysfunction in the basal ganglia, most notably in terms of low inhibitory control of actions and the reward system. The basal forebrain includes structures that are located in the forebrain in front of and below the striatum. It includes brain regions such as the nucleus accumbens, septal nuclei, and a variety of other forebrain structures. It receives input from the basal ganglia and the hypothalamus, and it projects cholinergic neurons from the basal forebrain to the cerebral cortex. That is, the cell bodies are located in the basal forebrain, and its axons project to the cerebral cortex, where acetylcholine can be released. The basal forebrain has important roles in arousal, wakefulness, and attention. Dysfunction to the basal forebrain can lead to attentional and intellectual issues, such as those seen in subdegenerative neurocognitive disorders like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. One important neuropeptide that is related to the basal forebrain is orexin, also known as hypocretin. Orexin-producing neurons have been proven to promote arousal and attention through projections to the basal forebrain. Cholinergic neurons in the basal forebrain receive these inputs from the orexinergic neurons. Orexin, as an excitatory neuropeptide, then leads to the release of acetylcholine in the cerebral cortex. In addition to orexin, GABAergic, glutamatergic, dopaminergic, noradrenergic, histaminergic, and likely a variety of other neurotransmitters, neuropeptides, are related to the function of the basal forebrain. Before we discuss the cerebral cortex, I want to briefly mention the ventricles. Ventricles are fluid-filled cavities within the brain, and they are filled with a substance known as cerebral spinal fluid, oftentimes abbreviated as CSF. Cerebral spinal fluid is a clear fluid similar to blood plasma, and it is produced by the choroid plexus, which are cells along the walls of the ventricles. CSF is very important for cushioning the brain and providing buoyancy, much like a beach ball in a pool of water. The third ventricle connects to the fourth ventricle at the center of the medulla, and it divides the left side of the thalamus from the right side of the thalamus. CSF travels between the ventricles, spinal cord, and meninges, which are layers between the brain and the skull. Meninges surround the brain and help protect it. While the brain has no pain receptors, meninges do, which is why meningitis and migraines tend to be excruciatingly painful. Cerebral spinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. From there, it flows to the central canal of the spinal cord in small amounts, and in the spaces between meninges in relatively larger amounts. From there, CSF is gradually reabsorbed in the subarachnoid space. If flow is obstructed between the ventricles, a condition develops known as hydrocephalus, which is the buildup of cerebral spinal fluid. Hydrocephalus often requires surgery and/or a shunt to remove the excess fluid, as the fluid buildup can be very damaging to the brain. We've made it to the cerebral cortex, the outermost portion of the forebrain and of the entire brain, the area of the brain closest to the skull. The cerebral cortex is the most prominent part of the mammalian brain. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture presentation, the cerebral cortex contains what are known as gyri and sulci. Gyri, again, being the hills or mountains, sulci being the grooves between these hills or the valleys. Gyri and sulci help increase surface area. If you were to spread the brain out flat, it would take up much more room than it does when it is inside the skull and stuffed inside, so to speak, such that it creates these folds. You can also see in the top left-hand image that there is gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is the darker colored cell bodies that in terms of the cerebral cortex are towards the outer layer of the brain. White matter are those myelinated axons that transmit information from the cell body to wherever those neurons project. The cerebral cortex is divided into two hemispheres that are each divided into 4 lobes. We'll talk about those lobes on the next slide, but for now I want to mention that the two hemispheres are connected by a tract of white matter known as the corpus callosum, as well as some smaller tracts that are referred to as commissures, most notably the anterior commissure. The cerebral cortex contains up to 6 distinct laminae, which are those layers of cell bodies that are parallel to the surface of the cortex, and that are separated from each other by layers of fibers. Cells are organized into columns that again are perpendicular to the laminae. Columns are not really straight up and down, though it does look much simpler to view them that way. But since your brain is not at a linear line, the columns are actually parallel to the surface of the cortex. All cells within any given column respond to the same stimuli. They work together to facilitate various functions. As I mentioned on the last slide, each hemisphere of the brain is divided into 4 lobes. While the lobes often work together to produce various functions, it is important to note that each lobe has a primary cortex and an association cortex. The primary cortex tends to be involved in direct processing of sensory or motor information, whereas the association cortex, that's sometimes referred to as the secondary cortex, helps with planning and integrating information from the primary regions. The association cortices regulate complex interactions among senses and behaviors. Let's start with the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex is located within the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex is sometimes referred to as the striate cortex because it appears striped in a cross-section. Damage to the occipital lobe can result in a condition known as cortical blindness. Unlike in many other cases of blindness, cortical blindness involves the lack of ability to visualize at all. So whereas many people who are blind in the sense that they cannot see are able to dream and to visualize within their own minds, when it comes to cortical blindness, visualization is not possible. That means even dreaming does not include any visual imagery at all. The major function of the parietal lobe is somatosensory processing. This includes functions like processing touch and proprioception, as well as visual spatial processing, such as knowing the difference between the right and left sides of the body, being able to use numbers, and to experience the world in 3D. The parietal lobe also helps with overlearned skills. At this point in our lives, things like reading, writing, and naming objects. The temporal lobe is located near your ears, and a helpful mnemonic for remembering the location of the temporal lobe is to think of tempo, like music or sound, being close to the ears. The temporal lobe helps govern auditory processing and receptive language. That is, the ability to hear and receive and read language, otherwise known as comprehension. The temporal lobe is also involved in sequencing and organization. Damage to the temporal lobe is involved in the pathophysiology of dyslexia. The frontal lobe has two major functions: voluntary movement and expressive language, whereas the temporal lobe is involved in comprehension of language, receiving of the written word and of spoken word. The frontal lobe is involved in expressive language, the ability to communicate in words and in writing. One really important area of the frontal lobe is known as the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is essentially the executive of the brain. It has many roles, including sensory integration, working memory, the ability to manipulate things in your mind, planning, decision-making. Many people even say that our personalities relate to the functioning of our prefrontal cortex. Underfunctioning of the prefrontal cortex has been linked to ADHD, whereas excessive activation of the prefrontal cortex, sometimes referred to as hyperfrontality, is associated with rigidity, inflexibility, and worrying, and may be linked to autism. This is just a brief overview of the functions of the lobes of the cerebral cortex. We'll learn more about the lateralization of the brain and the various functions of the brain regions as we progress through the course.